Welcome to the Good Grief podcast, which I always think it's funny to call it a podcast when it's on video, but I guess this is the new thing. I am excited to bring this episode to you today. And before I do, hit that like button, subscribe so that you can be notified, or hit the notification so that you can be notified when other episodes come out. I've got lots of exciting and interesting people in the pipeline, including today's guest, which I'm very excited to introduce to you, and apparently my cat as well. Stacey Johnson is a dedicated clinical therapist and women empowerment coach trained in mindfulness and emotional freedom techniques such as tapping. Stacey helps high-achieving women break free from overthinking, burnout, and stress. She empowers clients to reclaim their presence, enhance their well-being, and thrive both personally and professionally. Stacey provides practical strategies to overcome headaches, sleep deprivation, and lack of concentration. Check, all me. Fostering self-love, emotional resilience, and a growth mindset. Stacey has been a high-achieving woman and used her own strategies for herself. And when life threw her a curveball and she suffered the trauma of losing two significant people back to back, she was able to handle the challenge with her skills that she had instilled in herself. Now it is her mission to share the strategies that helped her be emotionally resilient and stop the whirlwind thoughts that consumed a lot of her time. Thank you so much for being here, Stacey. And
Thank you.
Impressive bio, and I think really that will resonate with a lot of people. Like I said, I'm like, that's me, and I suspect a lot of women for sure, and some men, that will resonate deeply with them. The more I talk to people, the more I realize there's a lot of us in the same boat. So let's dive into the good stuff.
Okay.
And by that, story that devastatingly altered your life. We're talking about grief. This is the Good Grief podcast. And so many people have difficulty just dealing with the loss of one person. And you had to deal with losing two people back to back within weeks of each other, and two significant people in your life.
Yes.
So is it okay if we start? Yes. I know we're diving in heavy and deep.
Yes.
But this is a good step to talking about the transition that you made, which is why I called this podcast Good Grief, because I want to assure people that as much as grief is a lifetime process, we can learn to survive and not just thrive. Or no, we can learn to thrive, not just survive. And you're certainly doing that. So let's take you back to that pivotal change when all that started to happen.
Sure. So it was October of 2021. And so back up just a little bit. About 10 to 15 years ago, I was a high achieving woman. I was stressed. I was burnout. I was working 45 to 50 hours a week outside of the home. My kids were in every activity. And I was noticing, actually, it was my husband that noticed first, that says, because I was always irritable when I got home and I would argue about the stupidest things. And he's like, why are you so angry? And I'm like, I'm not an angry person. But then I started to go back because I am a clinical therapist. So I went back to all of my professional development courses and I started to put all the pieces together. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm a high achieving woman that is stressed, burnout, overwhelmed, exhausted. And I needed to do something. I needed to put some changes in place so that I could role model better for my kids, because I started to see that they were starting to not manage their stress as well. And so I put
that energy, that when we put out that energy, kids pick that up so easily from us. And Am I right to assume you likely weren't doing any sort of self-care routine?
I was not doing self-care routines. I would exercise here and there, but I wasn't like consistent with it. And I probably didn't see it as self-care. It was just like, I have to do this. I have to exercise because I have to stay in shape. Or it wasn't like something that I found myself like I enjoyed it, but it wasn't like for me. It was like, so I was not practicing self care the way that I do now. So I put all some things in place and I started to notice a huge difference with myself. Now, fast forward to October 2021, and I received a phone call. My mom was attempting to call my cell phone 2 or 3 times. I didn't realize it because I worked at the time in an alternative school. And we weren't supposed to have our cell phones on us. So I had missed the phone calls. She had called my husband. My husband was enough well aware to know to call my office. So he called my office. I got on the phone and he said, "Your mom's trying to get a hold of you. Something's wrong with Dave, my stepfather." So I immediately called my mom and my mom said, "He wasn't responding to me. I think we've lost him." So we're at the hospital, the local hospital near them. So I immediately told my bosses I was gone and I left and I got to the hospital. And of course, he had passed. He had actually passed at home. They did not, he had he did never woke up that morning. My mom could not get him to respond. And no, that was like October 29th, 2021. That evening, so my mom immediately, when we first, all the kids got there, she was calm. But then it was immediately the shock hit her and she started to basically continuously repeat herself. I could have had a hard time getting her out of the hospital. Then my brother and I finally get her home and she now is suffering from chest pains. And we ended up back in the hospital that evening with her, and she was admitted. Her numbers, all of her symptoms pointed in the direction of a heart attack, but the EKG or whatever system said no. So it was very strange. They wanted to keep her overnight. They did. And then they wanted to keep her longer and do some more tests. And she said at that point in the morning, she was like, "No, I've got to start my grieving process. I've got to take care of things. My husband just passed. I need to start going. Like, I need to problem solve everything else." So we got through. And then that next, like a week later, like a couple days later, she did have a stress test. And they did notice that they wanted to do some more testing, but they were going to get through the funeral for her. We get through that week. The day of the graveside service that evening, so pretty much like a week later, my husband says, "I don't feel so good." And I'm like, "Oh no." And of course, this is when COVID was still high. And we obviously just had greeted about 300 people through the funeral home. And he says, "I don't feel so good." So Tuesday morning, I go to work. This is my first day back to work after a week. I get a phone call that my mom did go through, like my uncle was in town. So he says, "I'll take her to get her tests taken." And he said, "They're going to keep her. They're going to do a stint." I'm like, "Okay, I'm going to leave the house. I'll leave work now and meet you at the hospital." So she was getting a stint put in. My husband calls me and says, "I feel like a truck hit me." I said, "I'll stop and get the free COVID test." Sure enough, he was positive.
Mm.
So I take care of my mom. I give him some liquids. I tell the kids, like, "Hey, start isolating. Your dad is sick." I go and take care of my mom. My mom stays the night. I come home, take care of the house. few days later, my kids now have the symptoms. So now my kids are positive. And so I'm going back and forth between my mom and my household. And so a week later, so now we're 2 weeks past my stepfather's passing, and my husband is not getting any better. He's getting worse. Like, I can't keep him awake. And it was my time to go back to work because now I had been for the 5 days and I was COVID free. So I had not received COVID. So I was about to go back to work. That evening, my mom calls me and says, I'm in AFib. I need to go to the emergency room. So I leave the house about 11 o'clock at night, take her to the hospital. And then about 3 o'clock in the morning, she says, go home. They're going to keep me. I said, okay. So I go home, try to get a few hours of sleep. She calls me back and says, they're going to discharge me. There's no beds and I'm out of AFib. So they're sending me home. I said, okay. So I came and got her. So then I get home, I get her settled, come home. My husband I can't keep him awake. So now I've made the decision that I'm going to try to get a hold of his doctor to see what I need to do. My mom calls me and says her doctor needs to see her. So I go back to take her to the doctor's. And then I get her back home from her doctor's appointment and I make the decision. My husband's doctor has not called him. I made the decision to take him to the local ER. So now I have had no sleep. I haven't had sleep in 24 hours now. So I take him to the ER and I sit there for several hours before they tell me that he has double pneumonia, COVID pneumonia, and that he was being admitted to ICU. So I come home, I tell my kids, he's able to give us a phone call. He calls, and then he was in the hospital for a week. Obviously, we're not allowed to go see him because they don't allow anybody in, especially if they're still COVID positive. They did let me come in for a very short time. And then basically he was in the hospital 1 week and he passed. So basically 3.5 weeks after my stepfather passed, my husband passed. So then I quickly went into problem solving mode and picked up all the pieces and here we are. But through that, like I went back to work. I worked in a school. So my husband passed away the day before Thanksgiving. And so a school at that time were shut down until after Thanksgiving break. And then I have the funeral. So there was no reason for me to go back because we would be having 2 weeks off near the Christmas holiday. It was decided that go ahead and just take off until the new year. So it allowed me to figure out all the things that needed to get done house-wise, legally and financially. And so got through all that and went back to work. And then I really did realize like all the skills that I had from the past year, because I listened to some grief podcast. I had joined some grief support groups on Facebook. And I realized I went back into, now I started going back to my exercise class, but I was using it as self-care for me. I was doing more meditations during the day, and I really started implementing a self-care plan. And here I am. And then that was about a year after he passed away. I started doing I had to increase my income. So I started doing some telehealth as well as working outside of the home. And I started seeing so many women come through my doors that were like stressed and burnout. And I'm like, I'm going to start coaching because I want to help as many women as I can.
Mhm.
And I know that if they learn now the skills, then their future self will appreciate it, because I so appreciate that I have the skills to be able to be so emotionally. Yes, grief. I miss him dearly. I'm fighting back the tears now,
I
but
know. Here.
but it doesn't stress me out. Like I shared with you before we got on pushed record, my daughter called crying, car broke down, 10 years ago, yeah, I would have been like, oh my God. But now I'm like, it's okay. We'll get through this. Sure. I keep thinking, boy, if my husband was here, he would like just handle all these things. But it's now my job. And I told her, don't worry about it. I'll call AAA. I'll get it towed. You're safe. You're fine. You're not alone. You're with somebody. And we'll take on the next steps as they come. There is no reason for me to get overwhelmed and carry on about it because I need to be able to problem solve it. And if I'm all stressed and overwhelmed and overthinking something, then I'm not able to be the best problem solver that I can be. And that's what I know I've learned throughout the years.
Yeah.
And
It's amazing how our priorities shift when we have things like what you've experienced happen, where we go back to that mentality of not sweating the small stuff because ultimately, pretty small comparatively, you've been through some big stuff. So a car breaking down, you're like, oh, that one's easy.
right. Yeah.
What I went through previously, that was difficult.
Right.
And we shift our perception of what those things are.
Right.
And it also shifts, just really, it shifts how we view life,
Yeah.
right? And what is
Yep.
important and what is not important. And you wish, especially I wish as I age, I wish I could go back to my former self, my younger self and go, none of this matters.
Right.
Why are you getting so upset about the stupidest thing? Because
Right.
in the scheme of things, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, I regret now not knowing the stuff that I know now sooner because, yeah, some of the small stuff I didn't need to sweat back then. And I spent more time arguing with my loved ones than really being connected to them. And that is the one thing I do regret. But I'm also blessed that I learned the skills so that I could help my kids get through the grief process. Like I said, like my daughter's like this morning, she was like, Mom, how are you staying so calm? And so I'm able to teach them that so that they are more aware. They're only 20 and 22. So learning them now when they're 20 and 22 will help them become more resilient and have this growth mindset about things. And I have to say that they've said, Mom, like we are, because we've watched other people handle grief. They've watched a couple of my good friends who lost their husbands and not, they'll say, it was a good day if I got up and made a pot of coffee and let the dogs out. But they saw me getting out of bed every day, even after during that time that I stayed home for the month after his passing till I went back to work. I was still getting up. It was 3 weeks before Christmas. I wasn't going to not have the Christmas tree up and not do Christmas for my kids. I had to.
Do you think that what helped in that is having that feeling or that need to do it for your kids?
Yes,
They
I think
had
it was
somebody else to look after.
I think it was definitely that, but then also I'm a doer, that high achieving, and I think I just put it all I was like, they need it, but then I think I also for me as well, Christmas is something that I always enjoyed as well. I did it for me as well.
That's amazing. I know for me, I wanted to skip Christmas after my brother died. And we did. My mom and my stepfather and I decided, oh, apparently, cat still making an appearance. My mom, my stepfather, and I decided we just couldn't face the holidays, especially that first one. So we went away for Christmas.
Mhm.
Probably the best decision we could have made because it gave us an opportunity just to exist. We had spent so much of that year picking up the pieces. And when you lose somebody the way we lost my brother, he unalived himself. We're not allowed to say the S word on YouTube, apparently. It was picking up pieces and it was just trying to survive. I commend you for finding the strength to put up the Christmas tree because, as I often say to clients and to people experiencing their own grief journey, the year of first, that is difficult. And I often have people ask me, does it get easier? I'm like, I wish I could say yes, but it doesn't. And sometimes year 2, year 3, it comes back and kicks you in the butt harder than it did that first year. Because
Yes.
you're numb in that first year and you're still processing.
Yes. I would
So
agree.
I commend you, especially losing them that close to the holidays. And as you said, so close to Thanksgiving, which that also affects your view on that holiday. And
Yes. My kids do not really like Thanksgiving anymore. They weren't big Thanksgiving people anyways, but now they really can't stand it. So luckily, I've got my side of the family. My brother loves to cook Thanksgiving, and so he hosts all of like my side of the family, which gives my kids a little bit of peace, and they know that they can themselves and they can get occupied also with my younger nieces and nephews. But Thanksgiving is definitely a tough one. My kids hold their grief in their bodies. So I've got one that suffers from migraines and one that's been having some back issues. And so Thanksgiving Day, last year, they were like miserably in pain. And then it was like, once we got a few days past Thanksgiving, they're like, oh, yeah, it was probably the holiday that kind of, yeah. But yeah, the first year is definitely that year of fog. My daughter races four-wheelers and dirt bikes, and her dad was her mechanic, her pit crew, her everything. And she wanted to go back into the racing that first year. And so I was like, okay, let's do it. And she even says, like, now she's she took us some time off from the racing, which has been the first time since she was 4. So in 16 years, she's finally took a break from it and she had to have surgery. And she's now realizing, like, yeah, that first year, I was in a fog with this racing. And now I'm back at it. And there was like, we just went to a race not this past weekend, 2 weekends ago. And it was a track that her and her dad trained at all the time. It was more of one of our local tracks. And she was pretty emotional when we left. She was like, I was in spots, mom, that I was like, whoa, dad and I spent so much time in that section of woods growing up that she left the track pretty emotional. And it's hitting me more now that he's not at the track with me.
it's a double-edged sword because it's probably a place she feels close to him. And yet, because it's a place that she feels close to him, she feels his absence more. That's tough, especially when you're young and you're trying to just make sense of the things that just don't make sense. That's really young to lose a parent.
Yeah. Yeah. She was a senior in high school. She had just started her senior year, and my other daughter had just got her STNA, so was just starting her nursing career. And so, yeah, now my youngest is a senior in college, and my oldest is at our local career center working on her LPN.
Nice.
Yeah, and they've trudged through but yeah, it's young to lose their dad. I was 48 years old before my first parent passed away, and that was my stepfather. So I can't imagine being their age.
Yes. But you were also young to lose your husband.
Yes.
And so the thing that I want people to understand is the magnitude of loss in general. People try to downplay how they feel, or they try to be stoic. And I'm saying this because that was me. I was trying to be strong for everybody else, but it was because I was avoiding my own feelings.
Yeah.
And when you lose someone, you can fake it till
Mhm.
you thing, right? Like you can be stoic, but you were juggling so much at that time, right? Not just losing your mom, but there were so many plates you had spinning in the air at that time, right?
Mhm.
And you were also exhausted. You were exhausted before all that stuff happened. And then all that happened, it's that makes us less capable of coping when we do not have things in place for ourselves. And being exhausted and lack of sleep, we know intensifies emotions.
Mhm.
Well, initially, you must have been beside yourself.
I was, but I still never I immediately started putting some self-care into place. Once I lost my stepfather and then my mom was sick and going back and forth, it was prayer and then meditation started. But then once my husband got sick, yeah, I really started putting some self-care into place. I started bookending my day, looking at the things that I'm grateful for and looking at the things that I achieved throughout the day. Little, big or little, anything to wrap my brain around more positive things than the negative things. Being grateful that I had a house over my head and I had a good job because I'm educated and so I had a good job. And once he passed, yeah, I spent a lot of time saying, I can't believe I'm 48 years old and I'm a widow.
Yeah.
But then I started to like really, really put my meditation in place. I would wake up in the morning, meditate. I would put deep breaths into my day throughout my day and started the really looking at my self care and started really looking at the things that I can control and I can't control
Yeah.
and putting those things that I can't control back out in the universe and say, someone else deal with it because I can't. It's not my problem. It may be my problem, but I can't do anything about it. I can't change it.
Yeah.
So I'll just deal with whatever happens.
And I
And
think that's a good lesson for people to take, not just those dealing with grief. When I was a teacher, the one thing I constantly did with my students, because they would get overwhelmed or they would get stressed out, I would say, get a piece of paper, make 2 columns. What are the things that you can control and what are things you can't control? And then I'd rip the paper and I'd say, that's yours to deal with. And I'd crumple up the other side because I couldn't believe that at such a young age, they were worrying about things that kids shouldn't have to worry about or
right.
had no control over. And I think it's a good lesson, not just to teach kids, but we have to teach ourselves as adults. Can want to take on the world. We can't. We can't carry it all.
Yeah.
Or they'll break us.
Right. I think a lot of the things that I stressed about in my younger years were things that I can't control. I overthought a lot of things. And now I realize that there were times that I didn't need to overthink those things and overthinking the worry, like the what if. And I started to really focus on I can't control the what ifs. I can't keep asking myself, what if I would have done this? Like when my husband passed, what if I would have called his doctor sooner? What if I would have done this? I
Yeah.
can't I can't live in the what ifs because it'll just keep me stuck. So I really focus on the working on the current moments.
Yes. I call those the shoulda, woulda, couldas.